Well, I hope that you are doing well today. I hope that you've had a good week so far. I hope that you had a good Christmas. Now we're looking forward to the new year, Lord willing. So I just hope you're doing well. But I know that's not the case for everybody. I know people are fighting illnesses at this time. People are experiencing loneliness, especially over the time of the holidays, and we certainly want to be mindful of anybody that's hurting or anybody that's sick. So if we don't know that you're hurting or sick, please let us know about it. We want to let you know that we love you, and we certainly want to be praying for you. We don't have any announcements tonight, so we can go ahead and jump straight into what we're going to study. We're done with Genesis chapter 4. You remember we talked about Cain last week, so now we're into Genesis chapter 5. And Genesis chapter 5 is probably a less familiar chapter to a lot of people in the book of Genesis, because most people tend to skip over this chapter, because this chapter is all about genealogy, and we usually like to skip over reading about different lineages, right? So I do want to take some time. We're not going to read the whole thing, but I think it's important that we point some things out. So Genesis chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." Now, this is a bit odd, because this is the only time that the word book is used in this type of generational formula, we might say. So what is the author getting at by saying this is the book of the generations of Adam? Well, perhaps on the one hand, he's saying, I'm about to present what I'm about to present to you, and this information is coming from a book of sorts, that is, we should be thinking maybe of a written record. Or perhaps the author is saying, on the other hand, he's referring to some type of list or some type of document. That is, whatever he's about to say is about to be in the form of a list or in the form of a document. Now, the next interesting thing about this is the next sentence. "When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created." Well, okay, we're about to list out a lineage. This is the lineage of Seth, right, that we're eventually going to read about. Why does the author take the time to throw in that comment that God created male and female? He created man, male and female, and he made man in his image. Why take the time to communicate that to us? We already learned about that in the very beginning chapters of the book of Genesis. Well, this is, I think the author is trying to get the point across that, hey, although humans have been expelled from the garden, don't think that subsequent life is any less valuable in the eyes of God. No. As Adam and Eve were made in the image and in the likeness of God, all human beings after Adam and Eve are made in the image and in the likeness of God. That is, humans have intrinsic value. That's not something that changed, post Garden of Eden, right? Now, this is a detail that I think is worthy of mentioning and pointing out, especially when we get into conversations with other people about maybe abortion, and we go to scripture to try to combat the issue of abortion. A lot of people will go to the beginning chapters of Exodus and talk about Moses as a baby and his mother trying to save him, and how some of the kids were were being killed. And, we might go to the Gospels and we might talk about Jesus and John the Baptist as a child, especially, talking about the baby leaping in the womb. And we might try to draw a point from that, or perhaps we'll go over to the Psalms and we'll try to, we won't try, we will find verses in the Psalms about life being sacred and how God has formed life in the womb, and life is valuable, right? And maybe we come to Genesis, but we definitely don't spend a lot of time, I think, in Genesis when we get into discussions about abortion. But the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis are filled with verses that we can talk about when trying to show that life is something that is sacred. Okay, so our major point from verse 1 is that all succeeding humans are like the capital A Adam. Remember, Adam can refer to the personal name of the first male created, Adam, or it can be a general term for, like mankind, man in that sense. So man is like capital A Adam. Well, 3 through 5, man has intrinsic value. We've talked about that. Then we get into verses 6 through 32, and this is where we're not going to take the time to read all of this, although I do think it's important. But notice that verses 6 through 32 follow a certain formula. That is, person A lived X number of years and he became the father of person B. After that, he lived, Y years and had sons and daughters. And then, at the end, altogether, person A lived Z number of years. And we see this formula when Seth, person A lived X number of years. Seth lived 105 years. He fathered person B. In this case, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived, after he fathered Enosh, 807 years. And then we get this business about had other sons and daughters. And then, the end of the formula altogether, person A lived Z number of years. Thus, all the days of Seth were 912 years and he died. Okay, that's the formula we read throughout. Now, let's talk about some specific people from the lineage of Seth. We get down and we read about Enoch. We probably know about Enoch. Maybe we don't know about Enoch. Enoch's a pretty interesting fella. As we know, Enoch, by all indication of the text, had a very meaningful and intimate relationship with the Lord, and as a result of that, God took Enoch. That is to say that Enoch never died. He was sort of just almost like transported to the place that God is. But notice that Enoch is 7th in line from Adam in Seth's genealogy. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's important, something important for us to notice. 7 has the number 7 has symbolic value sometimes in Scripture to represent completeness or wholeness, and this is trying to show us that that God honored Enoch because of the way that Enoch lived. But then we read about an individual, Lamech, and Lamech is famous for being the father of Noah, right? We know of Noah. We might not know of Lamech as well. But Lamech hoped that his son Noah would bring comfort to those who were burdened by labor and painful toil. Now, notice that this is the result of what we read about in chapter 3 in verse 17. God said, "Cursed is the ground," because of what Adam and Eve did in being deceived by the serpent. But notice that the curse of the ground was realized by even those who worshipped God. This is a general curse that affected everyone. This wasn't a punishment for some wrongdoing done by someone in Seth's line. But notice this is the first time that we read that the ground, the curse of the ground, really troubled the people of God, and as a result, they looked for some type of relief. Okay, I think that's enough said about chapter 5. I just thought that those things were worthy of pointing out. That's not to say all of chapter 5 is not important. We should read chapter 5, and even though we don't like reading different lineages, maybe, well, not maybe, we should spend the time doing it. Okay, so we get to chapter 6, and chapter 6 is another interesting chapter, right? Because this is what we read in verses 1 through 2. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Okay, well, here's a problem. Maybe your chapter heading is like mine, and it says increasing corruption on the earth. Well, why is corruption increasing on the earth? Well, we definitely at this time have an increase in population. So are we to assume that an increase of population led to an increase of corruption? I'm sorry, I just did that with my eyes. I'm trying not to sneeze. Okay, another question that we have in reading the beginning of chapter 6 is, who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of man? Well, we have three main proposals, okay? One proposal is that these sons of God were divine beings, right? And God was upset with these divine beings because they obscured the boundary between divine and human relationships. It's one thing for humans to pervert sexual relationships with each other. It's another thing for a whole nother being to pervert a relationship between a human, a spiritual being to obscure a boundary. Let me say it this way. I'm getting tongue-tied. It's another thing for this is like an ontological problem. Spiritual beings are not supposed to be with human beings, right? There's a difference, a clear difference in being. It's one thing for humans to obscure sexual boundaries, and it's wrong, right, for a man to be with a man or for a woman to be with a woman, but they're human beings nonetheless. I'm not using that as an excuse for God condemns homosexuality, right? What I'm trying to make the case is that it is not good when we mix lines between human beings, but it's definitely not good when we mix spiritual beings with human beings, especially in a sexual way. Right, the one proposal is these were divine beings, angels, and angels came down and lay with human women, and they had children, and these children had extraordinary abilities, and they didn't use these extraordinary abilities for good. They used these extraordinary abilities for evil, and that is what's said to be the problem in a nutshell. Another theory is, well, these are the mighty rulers of old that were just able to get any woman that they wanted, and as a result, they had all these different wives, and they were guilty of committing of being in polygamous relationships, and God was upset about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. The other proposal is, well, this is a clear mixing of Seth's line. We read about Seth's lineage in chapter 5. We read about Cain's lineage in chapter 4. So this is a mixing between Seth's lineage and Cain's lineage. Cain's lineage is full of rebels, people that don't spend time worshiping the true God, the one true God. Seth's lineage is full of people that spend time worshiping the one true God. So the daughters of Cain mix with the men of Seth, and that really throws everything off. We can talk about that. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time about that. Jude chapter 6, not Jude chapter 6, there's not 6 chapters in Jude, there's 1 chapter in Jude. Jude verses 6 through 7 seem to lend credibility to the first proposal. But then we get to verse 3. So we see this increasing of corruption. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Okay, so one translation could say, my spirit is, not going to contend with man. Most translators and interpreters have taken that to mean abide with man. That is to say that God is going to restrain in some way his life-giving spirit so that humans don't live as long. So one interpretation is humans from this point on are only going to live 120 years. There seems to be a problem with that, because when we read about major figures in the book of Genesis, the first major figure in the book of Genesis that we read about dying before reaching 120 years of age is Joseph, who died at 110. So maybe God is not saying humans are going to this is going to be a cap. Humans aren't going to live any longer than 120 years. Maybe God is saying that these rebels and evil people living at this time aren't going to make it past 120 years. They're going to be wiped out. Maybe we are to read the flood that we're going to read about in just a few minutes into our interpretation there. I just wanted to throw that out. Well, here's the judgment for the increasing corruption upon the earth. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of his thoughts of his heart was on evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So we see the judgment of God here, but we also see the mercy of God, because he spares the righteous man Noah, and we'll read about Noah the next time, because we're running out of time. I would like to comment on verse 5. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart, that is the thoughts of man, was on evil continually. What's this business about mentioning the heart? Usually when we think about thoughts, we think about the mind. We don't think about the heart. Well, the heart, according to Hebrew thinking, and this isn't only just according to Hebrew thinking, many ancients thought this way, that the heart was the center of thinking and wishing and willing and feeling, right? They didn't equate that with necessarily the mind, but notice it's the thoughts of man. Now, these aren't, imaginary thoughts. These aren't thoughts that people have when they fantasize. No, these are thoughts with great potential of being carried out. We're out of time, so we're going to stop here. This is probably a good place to stop, and we'll pick back up next week. God bless.